So I want to do a quick video on some of the social change of the 1950s. We're going to talk about the civil rights movement in the 1950s in our next modules. But I want to talk about some of the different things that are kind of fun and maybe what you recognize from some of the movies and such that we talked about earlier. Uh, so some of that consumerism of the 1950s that we talked about is going to lead to a difference in the way we're entertained as well. One of those big things is televisions. So how many of you have a television in your family home? You probably do, right? Uh, some of you have two, three, four. Uh, I had a class once where a girl had 8 televisions in her family home. It's a very common thing. I know it's all changing with new technology and such, but this idea of having a box or something on your wall that you look at that you're entertained by is pretty commonplace. In the 1950s, this is new technology, right? This had come about earlier. In 1946, we had about 16,000 televisions in the United States. So the technology was there. Of course, these are big pieces of furniture, with glass tubes in them and things like that. Very different from the materials that are hanging on your wall right now. But you have about 16,000 televisions in the United States in 1946. To show you this shift and this quick change, again, this is kind of the long 50s. So if we have 16,000 in 1946, this is the year after the war. By 1949, just 3 years later, there are over 200,000 televisions being installed every month. I say being installed again because these are big pieces of furniture that had to be brought to the family's home and plugged in, and may not have the wattage and all of those things, right? But 200,000 every month being delivered. By 1953, 2/3 of all Americans had televisions in their home. So that again, that goes across all racial lines and most economic lines. Some of this depended on whether you had the right electricity or not. So that's a huge change. Shopping malls are created in the 1950s. Again, part of that's that move to suburbia that we talked about earlier, this idea of people moving out of cities and into suburbia. And there are all sorts of racial undertones. We'll talk about that in the civil rights module. But that's a big part of it. Coming out of this prosperity that we've been talking about and these changes, whether it's the televisions or the shopping malls, you have this creation of the teenager, which sounds ridiculous, right? Because obviously there's always been 15-year-old people in the world. But the teenager, as we think of them today, this idea of kids being able to get out of, stay in school, first of all, and graduate from high school, that's a huge privilege and perk. If you're wealthy enough, you can stay in school, right? If you have enough affluence. If you're poor, you quit when you're 14 or 15. How many of you have great grandparents or relatives that made it through the 8th grade? That was an accomplishment in those earlier generations to get all the way through the 8th grade. By the 1950s, no, everybody's going to go to high school. Everybody's going to graduate to high school. You have a lot of girls that are going to quit high school early because they're getting married. But the idea is going through high school was a privilege, a sign of affluence to a certain extent. But a lot of these kids, this baby boom generation, they're going to go to school and then they're going to goof afterwards, right? They're going to go to the soda shop and they're going to, maybe have a little side job, but they're going to have a lot of free time to buy those rock and roll records, to go work on their greased lightning car. Think about the privileges of those kids. And this is different from any generation before them. And I think that's really important, this creation of the teenager as we think of it today, right? Young people that have the time to think about things and explore and goof. Um, that's new. No generation before theirs had that opportunity that the baby boom generation had. Um, you have new icons, cultural icons that are going to come out connected to this generation of teenagers. Rock and roll produces so many different stars, and this is big and popular and new. Chuck Berry, Bill Haley and the Comets, Little Richard, Elvis Presley. You have a lot of music that is being created by Black artists that white kids are listening to. And you have a lot of music created by Black artists that white artists are then taking and making their own that the white kids are listening to. But this is a big deal. James Dean, actors like James Dean. So all of these things are connected, right, and go together. Another group that has a shift in their role are going to be women. So American women face a huge shift in what's expected of them. Often this is going to be middle class women that we're talking about, but you see a huge growth in the middle class across the country in this time period with all that affluence. It really is a new, dominant group in the American economy is that middle class. They own their own home. They own their own car. The wife stays home. The husband works. This is a whole new kind of concept that really takes hold in the 1950s, and again, across racial lines. So this idea of this cult of domesticity, right? And you can see the word domestic in there. All right, this cult of domesticity was the idea that it was American women's job to heal the nation's wounds, right? To take the men who'd and the nation and the hardships we'd been through from the war, and to nurture them and care for them, and to raise and nurture the next generation of great Americans. Some of this is a reaction to the violence and horror of World War II. Some of this is in reaction to fears of the Cold War and fears of the Soviet Union. There's a great book by the author Elaine Tyler May called Homeward Bound, and it's about that connection of the Cold War to women's roles during the war. But the general idea of this theory was the idea that the world would be a better place if women stayed home, and while they were, rather than the workplace, and while they were there, they kept a clean house. And you have all these new technologies so that expectations of the cleanliness goes up dramatically, right? If you have an electric vacuum cleaner, you should use it every day. If you have a washer and dryer, you should be changing the sheets twice, 3 times a week. These standards are going up because you've got the technology. Why wouldn't you do these things? The idea is that women are going to keep the house clean. They're going to have warm cookies for when their kids get home from school. And when the husband gets home, they're going to have a martini waiting for him. Take his shoes off, let him sit and be the man of the house. And then after you've put the kids to bed, usually by 6:30 or so, then you have a separate meal for the husband and drinks, and then you put on your pretty nightie at night. Sex was very much a part of this conversation about women within marriage, of course, but this idea that sex was a part of a happy home, and that it was women's jobs to make sure that it was there. So there was a lot of pressure on American women. It doesn't matter how tired you are from taking care of the 6 kids all day. You need to be there, and not just be there, but be sexy and all of those things. So this was the big picture of this, was that women's role and women's job should be to set their own wants and needs aside, whether it's work or whatever, and focus on the needs of the family. You've got to remember, these are the same women who were the Rosie the Riveters, right? These are the same women who got into industrial jobs, who found these positions, who found that independence during the war years. And now they're being told, well, no, you need to take care of your family, which of course is important. But it's a huge shift to say that's the only role you can have. Women weren't allowed to have certain jobs. Women weren't admitted to medical schools. Women weren't admitted to law schools. If women did go to college, and you have Texas State College for Women in 1950, right? Which is, of course, the name before TWU. Women should go there and should be smart and those kinds of things. But one of the big reasons you go to college as a woman in the 1950s was so that you can be an intelligent partner for your husband and you can raise intelligent, well-educated children. It wasn't about your own knowledge and strength. We're going to see all of this challenged in the 1950s, this limitation of roles. Not that those things are bad or wrong, but the idea that that's the only path available to women, when not all women want to do that. Some women do, and more power to them, but not all women do. So this is another important part of that 1950s society and these changes that are going on.